going to go ahead and just get started. So, well, happy new year. Obviously, what a strange context to start this conversation, given recent events. But as I'm going to take my cue from Mike and try to keep my mouth shut and just keep going on the topic at hand. So glad you all are here. Hope you enjoyed the break. I know I did, and I'm excited about our new focus in the work. We have, if you saw in the email yesterday, we have some really exciting speakers. Today, of course, with Dr. De Silva getting us started, next week, Jerry on the call here, picking it up. And we have some great speakers lined up and more in the queue to confirm. So I think it's going to be a robust conversation, and not our aim, just to clarify again, is we're taking notes as these things go. We're listening to recordings, taking notes, and really going to come back to you as we start to hear what are the fundamentals of the guidance that we think should stem from this situation that we've been in the past year. What can we learn from it moving forward for K12, sort of in the post-COVID world? So we'll be sharing those ideas as they develop over time, getting your feedback on them. And we're going to kick off today with Dr. De Silva, getting us set up in context in really what's the context that we need this guidance to land in, because developing guidance that's clear, that's concise, and that's actionable and effective is of course the goal. But that guidance recommendations, but those guidance plus policy recommendations, that guidance, if it doesn't land in a context that can receive it, then it's definitely hamstrung. And that's part of what Dr. Silva is going to help get us started on the right foot. As you've seen and we've discussed, we're going to start really with a preventative and bigger picture discussion here in January. Some of this is going to bleed together, just given the nature of the conversations. February, take a real look at sort of in the facility, in campus, on campus mitigation of spread, capital and operating considerations. March and April, looking at the more human side on sort of achievement gaps, what to do about it, mental health, and then really stitching it together as we get into May. And so I'm going to get out of the way here in just a minute. So Dr. De Silva, as you know, many of you know, with the Rhode Island School Building Authority, oversees their school construction program. He's a founding member of the National Council on School Facilities and president emeritus from 2017, frequent contributor to these conversations and many other important ones. Professor, practitioner, and just a great contributor to these conversations. We're glad he's here, and has some interesting framework and perspective on modern schools from its inception back in public schools in the 1800s, and look forward to that. So, Joe, welcome. Why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, David. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity. David, you're going to scroll through?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So if we can, that's a shameless plug for my book. I apologize. But let's, I wanted to start with, this past year, what we went through, and some of the frameworks that we tried to work within. And that's this hierarchy of controls and how that applied to how we all executed our schooling during this year. And so this is a pretty good thing. I've always liked this in the sense that it allows us to draw down what some of the most effective things are. Obviously, elimination, vaccine is what we want to be doing. Outside of that, we look to distance learning to move us from, that's yours. Could you, oh, that's your screen, sorry. So we did the distance learning initially. Then Oh, we needed to focus on the HVAC, do some of the administrative controls, and then obviously the masks in those orders and in the level of effectiveness. And we can see that engineering controls outside of distance learning is probably one of the most effective things we can do to control this thing. So if you could advance that, David. So what did we do in Rhode Island? So in the spring, like I think most of you, we went to distance learning right away. In the summer, we started to plan for multiple scenarios of in-person, hybrid, et cetera. We spent a lot of money on cleaning and disinfecting. And then in the fall, we attempted to make existing HVAC systems work as really what you would do in any school year. And then we really focused on the ventilation and adding box fans, if you will, to our schools. Well, come winter time in New England, those box fans become a problem. So we removed those and we started to add purification systems as we could get them. And that's basically what we've been doing from a facilities perspective. There's been some lessons learned, and I'm not going to tell you that what we've done in Rhode Island has worked. After all, 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago, we were the worst in rates of COVID in the world. So it's not like I can tell you that we were successful, but just some of the lessons learned. If David, if you could. So I think from my perspective, what I saw was that we prepared for a sprint, and in fact, we found ourselves in a marathon. And so what happened? Well, we couldn't get out guidance fast enough. Our teachers really stepped up, and our administrators and LEAs got distance learning going. In fact, we were acknowledged as exemplars at one time. But then as we started to look into it, we saw that there were challenges in distance learning. Our LEAs were really struggling with multiple scenarios and focused on that during the summer. And that really had us facing some really difficult challenges from an HVAC perspective. We weren't able to do assessments in time. We had a really tough time just getting basic systems working. A lot of our components just didn't work, and we didn't even know initially. And then we found that our newer systems were rather complicated and very difficult to manage, even though they were some of the most effective spaces to be in. We had a lot of different levels of knowledge, and decisions were being made local by school boards. And so that had a different kind of chaos attitude where everyone's doing things a little bit differently, even though we're in a very condensed and small state. And then confusion around resources, what we could use and whatnot. So that was the sprint of it. But then, how do we get out of this and realize that we're in a marathon? How do we function out of that? And so the key is that we learn some really important things, at least here in Rhode Island, and that is that HVAC systems really matter. And not that there weren't studies telling us this. I mean, there's bounds of study that indicate, the importance of ventilation, fresh air, and really comfort and humidity and all those things. But really making our systems functional is a long-term thing. It's not something you just, you turn a switch and everything works. So that it provides challenges. David, if you could. And so what are some of those challenges? Some of these systems need to be replaced. I mean, some of our newest systems the cost to retro commission them, to get them where they need to be is pretty significant. And so we're finding ourselves that in some cases we just can't repair, we have to replace. And then when you start to replacing, how does that make sense in a facility that we're obviously seeing, and not only are outdated educationally, they're outdated from a systems perspective, or the ability to have systems in them. So, but we know that ventilation is tied to performance. We know that it's tied to all these other really quantifiable performance elements. So I list here, it's not your old-fashioned HVAC. I mean, we're diluting, we're exhausting air, we're containing it, we're cleaning it, we're managing flow, if we're going to be responsive to a quality environment that doesn't spread disease. So how do we optimize these environments? And the issue is that, I don't know about your states, but in my states, our average age is, thanks to the study that the Cooperative Strategies helped put together in 2016-17 for us, over 60 years average age. Just our systems alone were outdated, many of them obsolete. A lot of our schools are really small, and we have a lot of them. They're not educationally appropriate. We have a serious paradigm here of facilities, and COVID helped reveal that. Could you advance? So, well, how do we get there? Well, we all know, I mean, we're all familiar with planning, but data is key. And I wasn't really sold on data because at first, but I understand the power of it, how it moves policy in such a way. So we need to understand our needs in our state. And that's a huge uplift. So for us, our evaluation that David's team and in collaboration with others did, we know that we have about a $4,000 per student need just on HVAC systems alone. And $1,000 of that per student is just ventilation. So it's a sizable amount of money, and it's a huge investment. For a $2 billion program, $500 million in HVAC needs, that's a lot of, that's a big commitment. So how do we get there? Well, we need to do these studies. We need to identify these needs. We need to take into account the condition of the buildings, the enrollments, the costs, et cetera, and the educational program. We need to do that because it doesn't make sense to invest money in obsolete buildings, and we have many. Our elementary schools today are very different than what they were, just 7 years ago. It's a different world. The project-based learning, the collaborative learning, the common learning. It's a different world. And so how do we get back what we've lost during this COVID time? And so how do we optimize these learning environments? The answer is simple. You got a master plan. And I bring back what I learned from my history research is that Henry Barnard, I don't know if you all are familiar with him, but he was one of the co-fathers of the Common Schools movement, which is our paradigm, right? The foundation of everything we do is based on the Common Schools. And interesting enough, Henry came from Yale as a student, was doing some facilities studies in Connecticut, then came over and became a commissioner in Rhode Island based on the need for facilities. And he was the first one to really document the kind of ventilation systems. And he's got a foundational book on how to transform that. And back then, as now, we're seeing school buildings are not fit for what we encounter. And so we have an opportunity now that that COVID has provided, oddly enough. And so in taking that, as we learn the lessons of policy and the practice of that policy and the necessity of timing of that policy is really key. But nothing, really nothing is moved without data. For us in Rhode Island, we did a $20,000 study in-house when we were in a moratorium in 2013, just to create a space about the condition of our buildings. You know, a few years later in 2016, we hired Cooperative Strategy and Jacobs, and we did a pretty extensive study of all our facilities, and we've approved almost $2 billion in that short period of time. We were in a moratorium to a $2 billion program, and the only way we got there was to shine a light on what was happening, and that takes a lot of you know, it takes a lot of energy, but it also takes a lot of patience, because there's a you know, a whole discursive space that we have to go through to make these things happen. They don't happen overnight, but it starts with these small steps that builds. And I think that COVID has shined light on the situation, at least in my state, that we need to do so much more, and we need to be very strategic about where we invest precious limited funding. So I really think that the timing could not be better as we, you know, as the National Council and Cooperative Strategy and the group as a whole advocates for a federal, you know, role. And we know that those federal roles are pretty significant. I know that we have some of our best buildings are still buildings from the work progress area. And I can tell you that a lot of our baby boom, you know, quick put up are really difficult buildings to work in. And today we're doing a lot more with high performance buildings, but those buildings are very complicated to manage and provide additional challenges. But I think we're at a crossroads here with the new year, new administration, and you know, with what COVID has revealed, that we really have an opportunity to change this paradigm of years of just, I feel, you know, inadequate addressment of the issues. And even in states that are exemplars at dealing with, you know, school facility improvements, if you go to them, you know, they're still addressing, you know, maybe 5 new schools in 40 facilities where 30 of them are completely outdated. So it's all small dents in it. And so this bigger push to really invest in facilities is important. And we need to do that not only locally, but federally. And I think now's the time. And how do we develop those policies that set up? How do we establish data? You know, how do we establish vocabulary so that we're all communicating the same thing on a national basis? So, I mean, I think that there's so much work here. There's a lot of policy that we have. I mean, we put together a lot of policy in Rhode Island. There are exemplars throughout. But I can tell you, though, that I have to say that as much as I would love to be here and say we knew what we were doing in Rhode Island, I can't tell you we did. It was really hard at first, and it's been a struggle, and we've had the tools to do it. So how do we get beyond that and move forward?
Yeah, Joe, thank you for the overview there. And what I'd like to do in this part of our conversation, Julie, that's the overview, and go back and hit some of these points and get feedback here from our crew on how to take these ideas and put them into specific recommendations that can be picked up and followed. And because I have 5 things, and this is coming from Joe from our previous conversations to build up to this day, as well as my notes from listening to you present it. And that's, at first the discussion was, this is a preliminary and very facilities driven thing, is we have to make sure our HVAC systems are working properly. One, make sure that's the top line. And then what I'd like to maybe drill down a bit is, what are some of the supporting elements that we can put out there to help make sure that actually happens. 2, when these systems can't be replaced or shouldn't be replaced, given the building that they're in, then replace as you're able to. And it's that word "should" that pivots into planning, which is, you'll know whether or not you should if you have data, 1, have a plan, and then fund it, 2, and then this optimizing existing learning environments. I'd like to kind of go back there, Joe, and get some of your thoughts in sort of under each of these steps. So going back to the very beginning here, when we're talking about fully operationalizing our HVA systems, I think we've heard from several speakers and know that this simply isn't happening in many cases. And I'm sure that you have an example or two that you could, illustrate that and hammer it home further. Well, how do we get there? Like, what's some basic recommendations under that to affect change? And then we'll kind of go down those 5 points, if that's okay.
Yeah. I think that the very first thing is these systems need to be working as they were designed to work. And I think in general, there's an assumption that they do because you hear a fan. But what we were finding out is that the actuator in the intake had been stuck for years, and we see this over and over again. And if you have all these louvers, all these actuators, it becomes a very daunting task to keep that up. And so you have to have these kinds of literal assessments of these things. And that requires funding, and that requires expertise. Retro commissioning, we were able to team up with our utility to get us some retro commissioning funds, but it only goes so far, and we identify so many needs. So the idea that we need to invest in just making the system work is key. I think one of the things we've struggled with is we've adopted policies that say you have to maintain it. We've done it quantitatively. We've done it, but what we're seeing is that the whole framework of the district, the local control, is it varies so significantly, and the buildings vary significantly. Some of them are relatively new and almost impossible to retro commission within a 2-year time. That's how long it takes for some of these things. And then to get the energy efficiency out of them, well, that is a whole nother task. So this is a challenge, and we need to invest in, I feel that we need to make them more user-friendly. If we can operate a computer easily, we should be able to operate controls with the same kind of level of interface. We're not there yet. So that would be a help. And really training and education for our facility people, and dealing with the procurements around that. So let's get this fully operational. I mean, HVAC is just one example.
Okay.
Right. I see some comments coming through, and I think so once we can get the systems that we have in there working the way they're supposed to, I think that's an achievement. But let us be honest, that is a 1-2 year concerted real effort. And then we're talking about, well, what happens when you can't get them, to any level? What happens when they don't have ventilation? All they have is spin tube radiation in classrooms. What do we do? And what happens when we can't put in those 21st century type systems in structures that don't accommodate them, while at the same time are obsolete? I think that's where we get into the optimization of learning environments, where master planning is so critical, where we start to look at the operational efficiencies. I mean, we built some new schools. We built one in Newport, Rhode Island, where it was cost neutral over the term of the bond, by just the operational savings, the consolidation, and all those. So there's so much to the master planning process, and really, I think that's something that has to be in policy, the requirement for master planning. But then there needs to be supports to make it happen, because in our state we have it in policy. But it's really difficult for school districts that are trying just to get, their educational curriculum and get teachers in the classroom and all those things to think about a master plan in the middle of this. But we really need to work on that and create the kind of, the space where every local district doesn't need to know everything about master planning. I think a greater state support role, and I mean a support role, because we're a local control country, it seems, and we're definitely a local control state.
Right. And that's one of the, I want to drill in a bit on this optimizing environments and sort of some of the pieces of that as you see it. To get to some of the comments here in the chat from Mary, Pam, and Jerry and others here, the local control. And that's one thing Mary was put out in the beginning. Is that one of the lessons that we need to potentially rethink in terms of some of these elements? If, like, for example, routine maintenance and preventative maintenance are so critical. And Joe, I don't know. Mary, correct me if I don't get your question right, but Joe, kind of one of my first wonderings on that one is, everybody's been clamoring so much for good, specific, actionable guidance on here, in the past year to navigate the pandemic with schooling. And part of the reason that doing this exercise is good guidance works within a local control context, but still provides some continuity and a roadmap for best practice. And I think that's one of the things we've been missing, is we don't know what best practices are. We don't have the data. We don't have a plan, and because it's just planned by Google, planned by Spitball.
Yeah, and I would concur that guidance is key, but what's also very important is the timing of that guidance.
Okay.
We issued facility guidance 2 weeks before schools were supposed to open. Right? There's no way that you can implement that guidance, even though that was really good guidance that we provided. At least we thought at the time. But timing is everything. But the local control issue speaks to empowering those closest to the child, which is a good thing, right? However, the role of the state as an entity providing that guidance, shaping and creating the guardrails on that road so that the locals can operate, that is key, and that's not easy, right? Because of that, it's always a struggle in my role to provide that local that guidance and direction, and while at the same time acknowledging the uniqueness of each of the communities, and so I am worried of separating the care and control of a facility far to some bureaucratic entity in some city, and I worry about that. So I like the fact that the people who are accountable to the teachers and the students right there have a certain amount of autonomy and responsibility. I think what has lacked is the ability to provide them the information they need, rather than the
And the
information that
funds.
we think they need, right?
Yeah.
And what we found during COVID is that they needed information far, much faster than our bureaucratic machine could actually get information out in a formalized way. And so we had to resort to other, grassroots types of distribution of information, as it was coming out, and that also creates, a certain amount of kind of stress in getting different information at different times, but responsive to what they need. But I really think that on the master planning side, that is really where the power of what you can do to improve schools. That's where you can optimize funding. That's where you can get real operational savings and produce really great environments and get the outcomes you need. But that that requires a whole infrastructure of planners, of educators, of engineers, and that's a pretty enormous task for a superintendent or for a business manager or for a facility director to lead, unless they have that kind of background to be able to do that on
Right.
top of, maintaining and understanding the building needs. So it's almost like there are two kind of worlds. There's the, working with the existing buildings and keeping them clean, maintaining, and then the planning and optimization and use of those. It's almost like they're two different worlds, but at the same time they have to come together. And I really think that the states have an important role in that, and documenting, or at least providing what the facility director credentials need to be. What are the master planning frameworks? How often do you update it? What are the basic tenets of it? What are the processes for developing master plans?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the entities? All those kinds of things are important policy to create in order to deal with this marathon as opposed to the sprint.
Yeah. Well, and maybe, Joe, I can bring up the comments that are coming into the chat in reverse order as they've come in, because I think there's a through line here back to what you've been talking about. And starting with Debbie's recent one about, hey, we're a small school district. We had this new funding. That's great. We need something actionable now. And as I have been talked prior to today and listening to your presentation again, I do hear a sequence to what you're talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong. And that's kind of how you laid it out. Is the very first thing is just right now, just making sure that what you have is working as it should.
Yeah.
First. And so if you haven't had the ability to do an assessment on the digital controls, on the mechanical controls, and on the mechanical systems themselves, like the nuts and bolts of your HVAC, have that done. Once that's done, then prioritize repairs, renovations first and replacement second as you can. And while you're doing that prioritization, create or refine or reconsider your existing capital plans or facilities master plans to think about the needs of the whole. And should you replace this HVAC system here, or should you be looking at replacing the building down like in the near term? And what's the best bang for buck in the near 3-5 year horizon? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the locals have a role and the states have a role. States have a role in providing, some of the templates for RFPs. So how do you go about doing some of this stuff? right? So that every district doesn't have to, learn it from scratch. And one of the things that we saw during COVID is that when you're local control, some communities got it going on. They have the people who can do it, and then some of the others don't. And as we saw with COVID, the repercussions of that are pretty significant.
Yeah, and it speaks, kind of working again bottom up here. Pam, echoing Debbie as in similar fashion. It's just don't have the money for the full-time staff everywhere to do it. And this seems like when you get the funds, again, get that assessment done, get your diagnostics, get your data. And that's step one always, is that what I'm hearing you saying. And then from the data, then plan and prioritize given your total capital constraints. But one of the and that's the short term, but one of the factors that we have to work on is that we are underwater as a country in terms of capital needs in our schools. And that's where the federal government having, this is not a big government, pitch time or anything like that. It's just specific to schools. It's just the problem is too big. And the federal government has had less than 0.5% of all funding in school buildings. And you referenced the WPA buildings as those back in the 20s as an exemplar building. Oh, but yeah. The 50s buildings are not. And that's something, I see that everywhere from rural Oregon to Rhode Island. It doesn't matter where. Give me a WPA building or a recent building any day. Most things in between 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, not so much. It's bricks and sticks. It's put up for speed and trying to save a buck, and it's not for the ages. The bones aren't strong.
I would also echo that funding is a problem, and that's why I think reaching out to entities like the utility companies, which focus on energy efficiency. Well, they at least in our state, they provide retro commissioning grants. That gets you off the ground, right? A quick retro commissioning will tell you your actuators have been stuck. They'll do some of that really quick stuff, and in many cases they do that for free with the idea of optimizing energy efficiency down the road. Also, we tried to, at the state level, to find during this time, we created a COVID facilities fund to just deal with the HVAC. It wasn't much. We're trying to get some bonding around this. This is where the data is key, because I can go to my legislators and say, look, we have $500 million in HVAC needs. Just 130 million of that is ventilation. At least give me the ventilation money, Right. And I promise we won't spend that on any building we're going to knock down.
Yeah, bingo. Right? Yeah, and that's the plan. And that's the plan side of the fence. And some districts run into trouble too, is when that's not in place and like, we need to knock this building down, but we just put $5 million in 6 years ago.
And there's a great way to ruin a program.
Yeah.
Very easily.
Yeah. So working up, I want to go to hit Jerry's question as a focal question, and then I know we'll pick that up next week, Jerry, when you're leading us well. But Jerry's question has been one of mine as well throughout this whole time is there a level of condition of a building, particularly a lack of ventilation or filtration, that should preclude it from being used as a classroom? And I'm not asking that to be answered necessarily absolutely in this moment on the spot, but that seems like a driving question behind some of this work. What's the point at which our classroom is not acceptable for use? And do we know the answer and therefore don't really want to ask the question because of what it implies? Like, I wonder.
Yeah, so from a policy perspective, I can speak to that. We put a basic educational plan together that required districts to provide safe, warm, and educationally appropriate facilities, do the master planning, and then we were going to do a whole existing building minimal standards, and we weren't able to pass that regulatory through there was no appetite. But we did see that with COVID. When we issued the guidance in September around facilities, there were a number of classrooms and spaces that were not occupied right away because they didn't meet the minimum ventilation standards. And so I think that was actually a positive element of this, is that in any school you would go, there would be significant areas that were non-occupiable because one, the mechanical units didn't work, or two, in most cases it's because the mechanical units didn't work.
So you have specifically, sorry to interject, but you have examples of, hey, we have these minimum standards for ventilation filtration. That's not happening in these cases. You're shutting down that classroom. It's not happening. Yeah,
we were doing that. We were doing that in September early on. We had instances in which mechanical systems hadn't been working for years, and so cafeterias couldn't be used because the unit wasn't working. And so they had to find alternative converted classrooms into, eating cubes with plexiglass and all these. I have to say that our LEAs were incredibly creative with how they actually, delivered education. I think that they are the unsung heroes of this whole era. I mean, what I've seen done, the creative solutions, and the attention to safeguard the health and well-being. I am so impressed. So you got to give it to them. I mean, I have to say our LEAs have done, miraculous things and outperformed any other, whether it be state agency, federal agency. I mean, they've been the ones that, and that's because they're the ones responsible, right? Ultimately,
Yeah, right. And
local education agency. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so Joe, in the takeaways from this conversation, and I know I see here some suggestions and ideas like from Cindy Powell, hey, about perhaps some incentive or rebate options, incentives rather, for HVAC improvements from a budgeting standpoint to set up through the states. I'm going to capture all of these chat notes and work with them to go and to elaborate on these notes. But Joe, what I'm going to do is take these ideas and spit them back to you in an email from offline here on these 5 steps. These 5 items that you've laid out.
I think we're losing you, David.
The next order conversations and steps to help. Am I back now, Joe?
Yeah, you're back. I think we lost you there for a little bit.
Little bit of a hitch. Okay, my apologies.
Yes. So one of the things that there are standards. AIA did develop a COVID assessment standard. I have to say we weren't that successful in implementing it, but it did lay out a whole process by doing it, and I thought it was one of the better ones. And then a bunch of one of our engineering design firms really put together a great document that helped us tremendously around ASHRAE and the entity in Europe and some of the best standards and how they related to the actual learning physical space. So I think there's a lot of good information out there. Are you with us, David? But I
Yeah.
mean, just,
Go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead. I was just gonna fill in the space.
Got it. Apologize if you hear any background noises. I scoot here, but I'll just take these notes and spit them back to you, and over the next few weeks we can work through offline, sort of fleshing out some of the guidance for creating a master plan, for looking at what involves in the assessments and how to consider optimizing your existing environments, and add that to the guidance here.
And Dave, there's one thing I wanted to say, is I really think that our roles, if we're really going to transform learning environments, we really need to be strong advocates and lead this stuff. And, without it, it doesn't happen. I mean, that's why I brought Barnard into the conversation. I mean,
yeah.
he spearheaded it. You need to be that advocate to push this stuff forward. Without that, it's status quo, and status quo is not working.
Right. And that tees up this next brief presentation and update on CARES 2 from Mary. And Mary, I think you're unmuted here. I see you. Can we hear you? You're unmuted on my side, Mary. So while we're trying to get that working, Sarah, your question about, which is similar to a previous question about Jerry's question, is pre-COVID classrooms that get shut down if their HVAC or heat didn't function, should we consider proper ventilation to prevent illness one of those things that also shuts down a classroom? I think that's a fantastic question, Sarah. I think that's at the heart, Jerry, of what I understand you were asking, and at least maybe, if not probably, it seems. And let's pick that up. Jerry, when we get into your conversation next week, I think that's a great question. Well, there you go. So Jerry's comment there. In Philly at the moment, teachers union and school district have agreed to 15 cubic feet per minute of fresh air per person in order to occupy a room. Okay. Great. Oh, I see your note there, Mary. Hold on, let me find you. So that's exactly what we're going to be looking for, is what are some specific actionable recommendations and guidance in those numbers will help achieve that. So let me see. Let me see if I can unmute you. Mary, I see that you're muted and I'm clicking, and all I can do is ask you to unmute. Let me, sorry, folks, I'm just trying to get Mary's audio working here.
No.
There you are.
Oh, there we go. Hey, everybody. Really great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, really great presentation, Joe. Really appreciated it. I love that you love data now.
I wasn't always a fan.
I know. All right, so we just got a few minutes left. After a absolutely torturous month after month after month of haggling in Washington between, the Democrats and the Republicans, there was what we refer to as CARES 2, which is about $900 billion. That was signed by the president on December 28th. And the part that's specifically for elementary secondary is $54.3 billion. I'm not talking about the governor's fund. There's a bunch on the governor's fund, which includes some funding for private schools within your states. and other access for, a few, billion, nationally here or there. But anyway, we're talking about what's specifically going to the states and the districts. So next slide. And so of the 54.3 billion, and just to give folks a sense of scale on that, I think Title I is about 17, maybe 18 billion dollars on an annual basis that goes out to districts. So it's a substantial amount of money. There was also obviously the 13.5 billion that came in March, but it's clearly far less than what many of the education associations identified as was needed, which was about 175 billion actually. But 90% of these funds have to go by formula to the districts from the state. However, the states can retain up to 10% of this funding, but they can only use 0.5% to administer the program. The other amount, which would be 9.5%, can be used for emergency needs, this is from the law, as determined by state education agency to address issues responding to coronavirus, including measuring and addressing learning loss, which may be addressed through the use of grants or contracts. And you'll see why I raise this, because I have an idea that I'd love some input on. Next slide. One of the things that our Basic Coalition and other, I suspect industry partners were instrumental in this as well, but we were able to get specifically on the allowable uses of funds language related to facilities. And these are exact quotes from the law, section 13, 14, and 15 on the allowable uses. So school facility repairs and improvement, inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement. You can see, a number of the things that Joe was talking about and many others have recommended in terms of being prepared for, operating in our pandemic and really operating schools that are healthy and safe throughout, our existence here. And, and obviously this catch-all other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of schools. So there's no lack of clarity that these funds can be used to address facility requirements. Next slide. So this is something that would love to have, just a few minutes of thoughts on, and people can email me, offline. But the National Council, we're just now formulating for consideration a recommendation. So, folks on this call who are members of the council will get the first view of it, is whether or not to make the recommendation to state education offices that 1% of the 10% of the state allowance should be retained by the facilities offices, if there are them, in the departments of education to help districts with their facilities planning and operations associated with reopening in particular, but obviously for longer term. And let me just show you, I want your thoughts on this, but I want to give you an idea. Go to the next slide. The kind of dollars that we're talking about. I don't know whether folks can see this very well, but I'll speak to, maybe we'll go to Georgia. I don't know if Mike's still here, but so Georgia will get from the CARES to $1.859 billion. That if the state were going to retain the whole 10% for state-related supports associated with, learning loss or frankly facilities assessments or whatever else, it'd be $185 million. It's a lot of money. But if the department, if Pat's department were to say, look, we need to be doing assessments, we need to procure assessments and some planning services and supports for the districts, and we think we can do it more efficiently, get them better information, better support. If we had basically 1% of that 10%, which is 1.8 million. So essentially what we're looking at is advising essentially 54 million divided throughout the states according to their Title I formula, to be retained at the state level so the states can do a better job providing guidance so it's not lagging, providing technical assistance, providing some efficiencies on some procurement for services or assessments or commissioning or anything that might be needed at the district level. And it's going to apply primarily to the smaller districts, not to some of your big urbans who, will have a hard time contracting, supervising, engaging, doing the quality control that they need on some of these procurements. So, that's essentially a proposal. And you can see, I don't know if Janice is still on, but Wisconsin, it would be about $700,000 that the state would use essentially to invest in its ability to provide services to the districts. The smaller one, Rhode Island, let's see, what would it be for Rhode Island? So, it's only about 200,000, 188,000. But frankly, you could do a lot for that in terms of helping your districts with some assessments or some technical assistance from your office, because frankly, it could be contracted, but it could be, a couple of full-time in-house engineers or other folks. So anyway, I want you to leave that slide up, David, and I'd just be curious, whether or not that's partly my question about, should we be building capacity at the state? I mean, isn't one of the lessons that we learned is that we have left our states without enough capacity to be able to address the kind of needs that we're seeing and the kind of emergencies that we need to be able to respond to.
Mary, so this is Mike. One of the, we require school districts in Georgia to do a needs assessment as part of their planning process, and that's how they access state dollars. But what I think that leads to is a wide variation across the state as to how that gets done. Maybe not how it gets done, but the fidelity with which it gets done.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
having a pot of money like this would at least give us the opportunity to have the conversation that centers more around what standardization looks like. But
right.
the main example I have is this idea of a facility condition assessment or an index. We do facility condition assessments with respect to the particular elements that qualify for state funding. But what we're not doing is getting to a number that would link to every facility in the state that gives us a good, which answers the question, David, about life expectancy. When do you put more money into a building and when do you walk away from it?
Right.
We do a pretty good job actually of walking away from older buildings. But by the same token, I'm not suggesting that's always the right answer.
Sure. It's not. Yeah.
So my point is, there's a side of me that says, you know you gotta have some general idea of, okay, what would you use that kind of money for? But there's also benefit to be had from having to deal with the issue of, well, we've never had that kind of money before. Let's see what we can do with it.
Right.
Also, I would think it's a great opportunity to get the kind of data and feedback that we need at a national level. If this money were to have a deliverable attached to it, whereby there would be some level of reporting that would be consistent from every state. As you know, Mary, it's very challenging to deal with the data that we have now, and make sense of it. So this might be an opportunity to help that as well. And,
I think that's interesting. There are reporting.
We can get
right.
More
there are reporting
funding.
requirements. Right. I mean, and I think Chris had a comment about, kind of one-time funding. You don't want to do hiring associated with it. And I think that's right. You might in this first year think about contracting, but certainly what we're anticipating is that with the bills that have already, one that's passed the House and that we know has the support of the president, which is a 10-year program for federal funding for school facilities, that while you might use some contract services in this year with CARES money, that you should be building some state capacity to to manage a federal a 10-year federal program, and that your districts and your state would be, they get good value from that if they did that. So I appreciate the point, but I think that we should be thinking, that this is really a marathon. It is not just about this, emergency public health crisis, but it's a longer term infrastructure crisis that the states are going to need, stronger capacity. I mean, I think that's part of what we saw, is that the states didn't have much capacity to help their districts deal with this crisis.
And we are just a couple minutes after. We'll wrap it up here in just a minute or two. I just want to make sure, Mike, I heard you write in one of your comments, and then give it back the floor back to you, Mary, here. Mike, when you're saying that you're getting various degrees of, I think you would use the word fidelity, or like just the products, and I heard that in context of the assessments and the plan, that those things are required, but is it right to say that they come in many different forms? And one of the things that would be helpful is some more systemization around what those look like, how they're created.
I think what we're doing is what we do is significant. Don't let me miscommunicate that. It's very significant. And
right.
And we identify $300 billion worth of need in this state every year.
Right.
But again, large districts with sophistication, have a different methodology for getting to that than smaller rural districts.
I hear you. It's a capacity thing, perhaps, for some of our smaller districts. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Which rings true with some of the other chats and comments we've had around HVA specific, and that's holding true on planning and assessments, broadly speaking.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, so to allow, so Janice, the recommendation, yes, it could be to allow the 1%, but it would be maybe that's a good language to say, because we're trying to formulate a letter, so that's helpful. Juan and I have a call tomorrow, and then there's a board meeting next week. So, if Guy and others, if you've got other comments, that would be helpful, because we're not trying to get anybody in a position they don't want to be in. But if you kind of have a plan for how you could use these dollars, I think it's really going to make enormous difference to have the states building capacity kind of little by little. And I think this is an opportunity to start. And particularly, Janice, in states where the states haven't been, providing technical assistance or support or guidelines or whatever on the facility side. So it would be, other thoughts you have on it would be really interesting. But thank you, David. I know we're over our time.
Yeah, well, that's also common. It won't be the last time. Won't be the last. And that's good.
Well, we'll be back next week. Yeah,
we'll be back next week, and kind of closing up with Guy's comment, kind of threading through with Mike, what Mike just talked about and several others, the resource challenge in terms of implementing
comprehensive assessments, and then following through with them in planning and the funding, of course, to boot. It's almost like when we look at this, I'm hearing we need to specifically address small rural school districts and the challenges specific to that profile of a district in terms of the guidance, as well as our large urbans who are really swimming with just a gargantuan dollar amounts of needs and all in a concentrated place, and then our suburban, and kind of maybe break it out a little bit, have continuity, of course, on the guidance, but some considerations for the different contexts and what might apply. So appreciate that. That's some notes, a takeaway here. Joe, as always, really appreciated your insights, and more to come, no doubt. And so thank you very much for your time in putting this together.
Yeah, really nicely done.
And next week, Jerry, I know if you're still on here, Jerry's going to pick up on this conversation and help us look at some of these issues from a very boots in the ground perspective in his work, and building off the planning side and communication with stakeholders, and to get things done. And that's excited about that conversation, and again, helping us to provide that planning and implementation planning, not only what to do, but how to do it when it comes to some of these plans, capital and otherwise. So please join us next week, contribute to that, and we'll look forward to it and appreciate his time as well. So, okay, well, we will stop it there. Got all the questions in the comments, and if we didn't get to yours, we will pick that up and add it to the conversation moving forward. Have a great rest of your day. Be safe, and look forward to contributing this conversation with you again next Thursday. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David.